Hello and welcome to Music Maps. We've been doing this over a couple of years now and keep finding new topics to talk about. So today we're going back to the 70s and we're going to talk about the pub rock phenomenon of the 1970s. Mark Wilkerson is our guest. He's written several books about Pete Townsend, about Pearl Jam and various others. So his new book is called Pub Rock, and it's released as part of the 33 and a third book series, which I'm sure some of you have seen. So hello, Mark. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Simon. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Right. So for context, just give us a picture here of what's around on the music scene, some of the excesses that are perhaps around here in the early 70s.
Yeah, so I call it in the book rock's Baroque period, which I think in the UK you pronounce Baroque, but it's very like heavily ornamented prog, and there's also glam around too. And the thing that I kind of took away from it was the word inaccessible, very kind of heavily ornamented Baroque style music that was not particularly speaking to the average person on the street about what was going on in their life. But maybe that was, it was clearly very popular. And maybe that was why some of it was. Certainly it required a great deal of like musical skill. The problem was it also required a lot of equipment in many cases, but also maybe it was just a really good form of escapism too, But so this book, it covers 71 to 77 and just kind of examining the year 1971 at the beginning. Very heavy prog year.
So 1971, so for context, Emerson, Lake and Palmer released a 20-minute concept piece recorded in 10/8 time, telling the story of an armadillo tank battling a manticore.
Right.
So there's one example. And the other one that really caught my eye in the book, which I thought was pretty funny, was this is Rick Wakeman being to blame here, but a 38-minute orchestral rock adaptation of an 1874 piano suite complete with Moog synthesizer solos.
Yes.
This gives you an idea. Rick Wakeman played live in a glittering cape amidst banks of electronic keyboards. So this gives you an indication of some of the stuff that we end up seeing a reaction to here.
Yeah.
I think by the early 70s, I think some of the venues in London that had kind of built the 60s scene, I think some of these places have started to close. Is that right?
Yes. And that's one of the things, so as we were speaking a little bit before you hit record there, I was born in the UK in 69. So this is this period that I'm writing about is my early childhood. So a lot of this stuff was going on in the background, but it was one of the reasons I was really interested in it. And another main reason was this period formed the music that I love. But a lot of the like socioeconomic stuff that was going on in the background at the time, the economy in the UK in the 70s got progressively worse. Socioeconomic factors got progressively worse. There was labor strife. There were coal miner strikes. So there were power cuts. A big part of this pub rock kind of onset was because prog didn't speak to people's daily lives. But yeah, the some of these, because of the inflation, unemployment, cost of living, some of these smaller venues that had a pretty tight profit margin already started to close. So it kind of, in my mind, increased the attractiveness of the pub as a venue.
Yeah.
Because the amount of small clubs, they were starting to evaporate. The big successful UK bands that had emerged during the 60s, in the early 70s, they would take off and go play the big arenas and stadiums in the US. They would go overseas. Or in the Stones case, they moved to France because of these draconian tax rates. So there was kind of an exodus. The small venues started to dry up, and there was an exodus of this big wave of British bands that had reached mega stardom. So there was it kind of created a vacuum there in the early 70s for some good roots-based kind of in-your-face rock and roll.
Yeah, so we've mentioned there a lot of the 60s venues are gone, and there's some quite wild music being made in the rock realm at this point. And also, like we say there, the Stones and Zeppelin and others have kind of left the UK. So regular listeners will know that Music Maps usually, not always, starts with a place. So that place is the Tally Ho in Kentish Town here in London. What ends up happening here is a Monday night with about 40 people there, and this kind of gets this whole thing going. So what can you tell us about this place, the Tally Ho, and the sort of accidental revolution which it kind of starts?
Yeah, so it does seem very much like a lot of, like most of history probably, as an accident. There was an American band called Eggs Over Easy, which is a pretty interesting name for a band.
In the Google era, that's a terrible name for a band.
Yes. Exactly.
It's going to lead to lots of recipe websites, isn't it?
Exactly. And later on, if you Google, there's another band with a kind of a gastronomic themed name. Bees Make Honey was another pub rock band. And of course, if you Google Bees Make Honey, you're going to get, yeah. And this is how. But Eggs Over Easy was an American band that had been in the New York area, and they'd been playing gigs in New York in small venues, pubs, essentially. They were kind of under the wing of Chas Chandler. They came over to London to record an album, and they rented a house not far from the Tally Ho. The Tally Ho turned out to be the closest pub to where they lived. And they approached the Tally Ho to see if they could start playing. They wanted, they were in the middle of recording an album. They wanted to kind of tighten up their sound and keep sharp during the sessions. And it turned out that the prevailing genre that was being played in pubs in that area at the time was generally jazz. And my assumption is, or my thought after speaking to people and doing some research on it was music you could drink to. It was kind of background music.
Yeah.
And of course, if you're listening to jazz, you're probably, as far as looking at it from the eyes of the proprietor, you're probably generally well behaved as well, as far as the average pub goer. So they had to kind of fudge it a little bit and say, yeah, we definitely we play a little bit of jazz, which they didn't. They were kind of a laid back kind of Americana, almost kind of Eagles-y kind of approach. So anyway, with the help of Chas Chandler, they booked a show at the Tally Ho, and it was on, I think it was a Tuesday night, like a really slow night. And it worked well. Like they got a decent audience that night. And despite the fact there was no jazz, the manager of the pub was impressed enough that they invited him back. And over the coming months, their bookings increased from 1 a week to 2 a week to 3 a week, and they started kind of elbowing out these jazz acts. But yeah, Eggs Over Easy kind of accidentally were the first domino there to kind of demonstrate to everybody that, hey, there is an audience and an appetite for this, what we generally call it's like roots rock. That's one of the difficult things with pub rock is, especially in a book in the genre series, there were a ton of different styles being played. It did start off, generally speaking, as, like I said, kind of laid back Americana type stuff. And over the years, it got harder and harder and shorter songs and poppier and more immediate. But one thing that did kind of define pub rock was these guys were really good musicians. They were very sharp, tight bands. I think part of that is you're not going to succeed as a pub rock band in an intimate environment if you're trying to mask any inadequacies, because you're right there. The audience is right there. They can see what you're doing. But the Eggs Over Easy guys were, excellent musicians. They had a pretty huge repertoire of songs, and they weren't shy about doing cover songs. They kind of laid the groundwork for some of the other pub rock bands at the time.
Yeah, so I think this place, the Tally Ho, it's a big Victorian pub, Fortress Road, Kentish Town, very close to the Kentish Town Forum. I'm sure some listeners have seen a show there over the years. I think it was demolished. Was it about 20 years ago or so?
I think so. Yeah. I did a really interesting, fascinating tour of a lot of these venues a couple of years ago. And yeah, it's a co-op. Well, a couple of years ago anyway, it was a co-op with some flats above it.
There's a couple of significant pubs in that area. There's the Bull and Gate, which is next to the Forum too, I think, which is a famous gig venue. So also at the Tally Ho, there's this band, Brinsley Schwartz, which I think some people might know if you're a fan of Nick Lowe. Perhaps you might be aware of them. So are they another band who start playing at this same place?
Yeah, and it was Eggs Over Easy that got the attention of Brinsley Schwartz. And Brinsley Schwartz actually decided, they were impressed enough that they took about 6 months off and decided to emulate Eggs Over Easy. Yeah, Nick Lowe and one of the other guys in Brinsley Schwartz saw Eggs Over Easy perform, and they met with them later and just to kind of, get to know them a little bit and understand them a little bit better, and thought, man, we want to do that. We want to, increase our repertoire, increase our chops. And another piece of the Brinsley Schwartz story too was, they had, when was that? In early 1970, they had a little bit of a moment of like overzealous management, and they had booked a show opening for, I think it was Van Morrison and Quicksilver Messenger Service at the Fillmore in New York. And this is a band who had never played on a big stage before. Their management had booked a plane full of journalists and fans coming over from the UK, which had a whole series of mechanical issues. Meanwhile, Brinsley Schwartz had a whole series of issues getting into the US, which resulted in them showing up at the last minute with no ability to rehearse before they were kind of carted out on stage, and a bunch of irritated and inebriated fans and journalists showing up at the last minute for the show. And this whole thing became known as the Hype, because it was such an enormously hyped event. Brinsley Schwartz's performance was kind of okay, but it didn't like change the face of, the history of rock or anything like that. And they had hyped it up so much that just okay wasn't good enough. So they kind of left with their tails between their legs. But more importantly, they left having learned a lesson that, we're just going to cut out all this crap, the hype stuff, and we're just going to get down to the basics, be good musicians, no pretense. We just want that intimate connection with the audience, and we're not trying to hype anything or buy into any of that anymore. So I think that was a big reason that what they saw with Eggs Over Easy, they were like, yeah, we want to do that. We just want to do music that feels good, and we want to do it at an intimate level. Brinsley Schwartz, late 71, early 72, started playing at the Tally Ho. They throughout, one of the things I love with this pub rock story, they are a thread, especially Nick Lowe, that runs through the entire length of this story. And some of the venues, the Tally Ho didn't survive, but other venues like the Hope and Anchor particularly are threads that run almost the entire length through this. So it's really interesting to watch Brinsley Schwartz, the evolution of Brinsley Schwartz over the years. Another thing so they did emulate Eggs Over Easy. Another band that they really emulated was The Band, Robbie Robertson's group that played at the Royal Albert Hall in 71, I think it was, and the guys from Brinsley Schwartz were there. This is another band, really good chops and musicianship, a little anti-hype, very much return to roots, back to basics kind of approach.
Yeah, so we mentioned there Nick Lowe becomes a figure that runs all the way through here. But I mean, they make some strange decisions, because I think they declined to appear on Top of the Pops. They turned down a tour with Elton John. They do play a support slot for Wings at the Hammersmith Odeon. And then I really like the detail here that as soon as they finished, they headed across London to play a pub in Kensington.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool that actually on the same night, they'd play some, at the Hammersmith Odeon, and then all jump in a van and go play on this little tiny stage at the Kensington. And yeah, I was thinking about Nick Lowe earlier as what he kind of evolved into, but maybe he was this way all along, very earnest, sincere songwriter with just amazingly they sound simple. I was going to describe them as simple, but I don't think they are pop songs. But there's a big component of Nick Lowe that's very irreverent too, and rebellious, you know? So I think based on some of the lessons that they had learned in the early 70s, they didn't want to maybe oversell what they were doing. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot, by, turning down Top of the Pops or turning down support acts. But it's almost like, we tried that and we're not comfortable stepping into that realm. So we just want to stay in our lane, When they went on the road with Wings, their manager, Brinsley Schwartz's manager at the time, Dave Robinson, was like hoping that the Wings approach would like rub off on them and that that Brinsley Schwartz would want to take the next step up the ladder of, success, but they just didn't want to. They just wanted to play in pubs and they were okay with that. Just like they had a comfort zone and they wanted to stick with it.
So how long does it take for this circuit to build up? And besides the aforementioned Tally Ho, where else starts to build as the sort of venues that people are playing?
Yeah, so in 72, 73, the Lord Nelson and the Hope and Anchor in Islington popped up. And those were two really important, especially the Hope and Anchor, really important venues in the story. And the Hope and Anchor in particular is a thread that runs the entire rest of the way. And it's still, it's still open. It still hosts music to this day. So, and of course, they built a studio upstairs in the Hope and Anchor. So it became a very the central venue in the pub rock story in my mind.
Was there any reaction in the music press or the media to this scene that appears?
One of the reasons that I really loved researching this book, and back when I did my book about Pete Townsend, and also I did a book about Thunderclap Newman, I love digging into the old, whether it's microfilm or actual physical copies, or going to the British Library and looking at bound copies of Melody Maker and NME and Sounds and Disc and Music Echo and all these old, Record Mirror, these old music publications. It just so happened that the early 70s was really getting into the heyday of those weekly, very distinctly British music publications. There was nothing else like it anywhere else. There was Rolling Stone in the US, which came out in 67, but it wasn't weekly and it wasn't exclusively music. There was politics in there too and current events. The UK music publications were weekly. They were strictly music and they were hugely popular. The big five of them, when you get into 72, 73, they're selling, 500,000 copies a week. And they picked up on the pub rock scene, and a couple of them in particular became champions of it. So it's certainly just again by luck with the timing of the medium, radio, and the publications that were coming out at the time were big supporters of pub rock.
Who first coined the term pub rock?
Yeah, John Collis in Time Out was the guy that came up with the term, or he's mostly credited with the term pub rock.
And I think John Peel kind of plays a bit of pub rock on his show too, so it's getting a bit of media exposure here. What about Ian Dury? Where does he fit into this?
Yeah, and Ian Dury's one of the guys that I remember when I was a kid, and of course it wasn't during the pub rock era, but I remember seeing him on Top of the Pops. And how do you forget seeing somebody like Ian Dury? He was such a one-off, unforgettable character for multiple reasons. His physical appearance, which, part of it was his disability because he contracted polio when he was a child, but also I think that personality, which a big part of it was probably formed from being bullied and also growing up with a physical disability, but also the fact that he had been steeped in an art school culture, going to Royal College of Art, studying under people like Peter Blake, having a sensibility of physical, not just the musical piece of it, but also the clothing and just the way he presented himself physically. They So his band, Kilburn and the High Roads, arrived on the scene in late 1971. Interestingly, since I wrote a book about Thunderclap Newman, their first gig, they opened for Thunderclap Newman in 1971. And Kilburn and the High Roads were just not like anybody else. Ian Dury would sing with his English accent. Actually, it turns out he kind of exaggerated like a Cockney accent that he didn't really have, but he kind of emphasized his Englishness. He also spoke very directly about issues on this, in like the street, like life, just prosaic reality, rather than singing about battling a manticore or something like that. He was a very kind of rough around the edges character. I include a write-up in, is it The NME by Nick Kent? The first time he had seen Kilburn and the High Roads, he didn't know who the hell Ian Dury was or who this band were. And he describes them kind of coming out on stage, and it's just really cool because they just blew him away. So yeah, they showed up 71. They kind of hit the scene in 72 and start playing the pubs. And of course, Ian Dury was kind of, there's a quote in the book where he describes, we were playing at the Lord Nelson, but to us it was like the Royal Albert Hall,
Right, Yeah.
But they were a very early example, the earliest example of pub rock starting to get harder. Bands that are not smiling at the audience or smiling at each other on stage, that have an air of menace, and a very direct line starts to emerge from Ian Dury to punk, to the Sex Pistols in particular.
Yeah, Dury's the kind of line that leads this all to punk. I would like to quickly mention the college where Ian Dury studied is actually about a 3-minute walk from where I sit now, just around there on Forest Road. So yeah, Waltham Forest College, as it's known today, has a massive history with Ian Dury. You mentioned Peter Blake, Damon Albarn's dad also was head of art there. So Peter Greenaway, filmmaker, attended. Ray Davies from the Kinks may have even attended there at one point. So it's got a massive history as an art college. So anyone that's in Walthamstow for one of our live events, have a look at it. It's got a really cool, they have got a blue plaque outside about its history. So you can look that up. So yeah, Dury kind of joins this up with punk, I guess. Was there a sense that the sort of energy of this whole scene never really gets down onto vinyl?
Yeah, it's interesting. Another link between Ian Dury and the Sex Pistols is Kilburn and the High Roads' first single, Rough Kids, was produced by Chris Thomas, who ended up producing Nevermind the Bollocks. One of the reasons, if not the reason, that he produced Nevermind the Bollocks is because some of the members of the Sex Pistols loved the sound of Rough Kids. Another reason is that Steve Jones was a big Roxy Music fan, which is kind of interesting when you think about the guitarist of the Sex Pistols. But at that point, Chris Thomas had produced 3 Roxy Music albums too. So Chris Thomas is another, direct link between Ian Dury and the Sex Pistols. One of the things that Chris Thomas told me, I didn't interview a ton of people for this book as far as including quotes, because it's a short book. These 33 1/3 books are about a third the size of a normal kind of, paperback size book. But I did include some quotes from Chris Thomas, who talked about, he wasn't really impressed with pub rock and with the energy of pub rock. One of the reasons that Nevermind the Bollocks is such an iconic recording is the energy just jumps out at you, just from the recording. And it seems that he was able to do that in a way that to kind of coax that energy and capture that energy in a way that a lot of other people couldn't. He's not sure why. He was supposed to make an album with Kilburn and the High Roads. He only ended up recording 2 songs, the A and the B side. And he thinks it was probably budget related. And he thinks also that may be why, some of the pub rock bands weren't captured very effectively in the studio, was budget and, equipment and that kind of stuff. But yeah, a lot of the pub rock bands, it was like you had to be there kind of thing. A lot of the recordings are not available, like to, streaming. somebody asked me to put a playlist together, and I'm like, well, I'm kind of handcuffed because a lot of the, like Bees Make Honey, for example, I think it's like one song on Spotify. So,
Right.
there's not a lot out there. But yeah, a lot of it didn't translate. A lot of the recordings that are available are not super impressive, today. The energy and immediacy doesn't translate.
One band who I think probably do translate to vinyl is Dr. Feelgood. So they're another band we should mention here. So where do they come into this?
Absolutely. And another, a couple of unforgettable characters there in Lee Brillo and Wilco Johnson. And another example, certainly the biggest outside of, Ian Dury, of a band that had an air of menace and would glare at the audience, or in Wilco's case, would machine gun the audience with his guitar. And that, they weren't smiling at each other again. They had short hair and just had this attitude about them. They show up in the mid 70s and they start playing the Kensington. I think their first gig actually was filling in for another pub rock band, Ducks Deluxe, that didn't play that night for whatever reason. So the Feelgoods played. They were from Canvey Island, from Southend, which is interesting because the Kersal Flyers and Eddie and the Hot Rods are all from that area too. You wouldn't think it was a hotbed of musical talent, but apparently I'm wrong. But yeah, they show up in the mid 70s and really kind of take the scene by storm. And I think when you look back at the pub rock era, they were the most successful pub rock band, as far as they had the image, they had the chops, and they had the songwriting prowess as well, where they had singles and they were successful and they started moving up the ladder. That was kind of their undoing, because again, some of the guys in the band, Wilco, to be in particular, wasn't really comfortable with that. He wasn't comfortable with playing on, with kind of climbing the ladder.
Yeah, it feels like they're from a little bit of they're coming in at a different angle here from Canvey Island, as we said. Wilco's got his Telecaster, which at this point is not a fashionable instrument, and they're coming in from a slightly different place. But do they actually end up being the sort of first band to actually break through with some actual commercial success?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. They went over to America, and that was not, Wilco wasn't super impressed with that either. And again, Nick Lowe is everywhere in this story. Nick Lowe somehow attached himself as their like guitar roadie. The Feelgoods got a major label record deal, and there was a pretty good sized touring budget for them to come over to the States. So Nick Lowe, kind of made himself available and came over and just called himself the guitar roadie. Yeah, they were successful. They their first couple of records were not necessarily successful, but a little bit later down the line, they had hits and they would sell out venues, and they were, they made the jump to bigger stages where many pub rock acts never did.
Yeah, there's a pretty big tour, isn't there, here in 75, and it ends up being pretty important because a lot of people who form bands immediately actually attended this tour. I think there's Paul Weller, Graham Parker, Joe Strummer, that all saw gigs here and then went on, and within a year or two, they've all got their own band.
Right. Exactly. Yep. It was called the Naughty Rhythms Tour. Yeah. Which is one of the first times that Andrew Jakeman shows up on the scene, who was influential with, later on with Stiff Records. But yeah, the Feelgoods emerged from that tour as a force. They kind of came out of that tour victorious. These guys played short songs. They had that air that you could draw the line from them to punk as well. They had this air of menace about them. They had short hair. They weren't smiling at you when they played. Their songs were pretty aggressive in many cases. You could, and all along these years, 71, 72, 73, 74, the economy, unemployment, labor, and also violence from, with the IRA coming over to England. There was a Dr. Feelgood show that actually was stopped in Birmingham because there was a bombing just right down the street from where they were playing. All of this is going on in life in the UK. And in my mind, the music started to reflect that harshness started to be reflected in the music, and maybe the appetite for that kind of music that's speaking to what's going on in my life right now increased. So these bands like Kilburn and the High Roads and Dr. Feelgood, and a little bit later on, the 101ers at the same time, Joe Strummer's early band, and Eddie and the Hot Rods and bands like that, they're starting to pick up steam as things kind of get more difficult.
Yeah, they do actually have a number one album with a live album, and they share the top 5 with ABBA, the Stylistics, the Bay City Rollers, and the Beach Boys. So their presentation is pretty different to what else is around at the time. But I want to mention John Mellor, aka Joe Strummer. So he's another name who emerges from this whole thing. What had Joe been up to? How does he end up entering this world?
He was in a squat at 101 Walterton Avenue, and you might have to help me with what area that is.
Walterton Road, Maida Vale.
Maida Vale, that's right. And if you go there today, just a very, very short walk from where that building used to be was the Chippenham pub. So they used to play in a room at the Chippenham pub. So they kind of, forced their way into the pub rock scene. They called themselves the 101ers because they lived at 101 Walterton Road. And these guys were on they'd call it a shoestring budget, but I don't know if it was that. They were recording in a basement with just whatever they could find. And again, if you think back to the beginning of the 70s and you're going to see whatever ELP or something, if I'm a 14-year-old and I'm thinking about, I can play a couple of chords on the guitar, I'm not going to stand there and look at these guys and go, I could do that. I'm going to try and, make my own band. But if the pub rock scene kind of made it where you could, it was much more accessible. You could be like, man, this is inspiring me to start my own band, and that's kind of how the 101ers popped up. They were just doing covers and just figuring things out as they went. And they're, the very early 101ers gigs, their drummer really didn't know how to play the drums and things like that. And Joe Strummer says, I changed my name to Joe Strummer because that's what I do. I strum the guitar. I'm not playing single note guitar solos and stuff. I just want to play chords. So it was very simple rock and roll. But the thing, of course, with Joe Strummer was the delivery, the intensity of the delivery, the no holds barred approach, which again is kind of honed in that intimate setting of a pub. And I include a Melody Maker write-up of the early days in the Chippenham pub, which just kind of does a really good job of, the guy that wrote it was really kind of fearing for his life when he was watching this 101ers performance, and the police show up and there's some of the audience is fighting with each other and there's knives and bottles and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, they show up right in the middle of this, this transition as the scene is hardening. A lot of these bands were kind of flashes in the pan. By the time the 101ers first single had come out, they had basically disintegrated, That's how quickly we're moving.
Yeah, they're not around for too long. The detail I loved was that the band pushed their equipment to gigs in an old pram, which was subsequently stolen outside the Elgin in Ladbroke Grove. So again, formerly my local pub when I lived over there about 20 years ago now. But I lived there and saw a clip of it in West Way to the World, Don Letz's wonderful film, and thought, wow, this is actually my local pub. But it had changed a lot by that point. But it is, like the Hope and Anchor, still there to this day.
Oh, right.
One venue that hasn't survived is the Nashville in West London. So April the 3rd, 1976, a band called the Sex Pistols open for the 101ers. So what changes here after the pub rock world collides with punk?
Maybe I'd forgotten how much of an explosion they were. And I mean an explosion as far as the impact on the scene and also how quickly it kind of ended, But when the Sex Pistols showed up, like the reason the 101ers disintegrated was the Sex Pistols. When Joe Strummer saw the Sex Pistols, He was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do that. And the rest of his band were not on board with that. So he was like, okay, I'm leaving. And very, very quickly after that, the Clash was formed. When the Sex Pistols' first gig, they were opening for a band called Bazooka Joe. And the guy who became Adamant was their bass player. And when he saw the Sex Pistols, he's like, I'm done. I'm now going to do that. I'm going to become something else. So that's how big of a deal the Sex Pistols were. Their delivery, their approach, their energy, and their just dripping attitude and irreverence it's infectious isn't a good enough, maybe contagious, was the word. There was a basis for all that back in like 72. There's American bands that set the scene for some of that stuff that showed up in the UK. The New York Dolls, Lou Reed, and Iggy and the Stooges were all in London in 72. And of course, Brinsley Schwartz opened for Lou Reed at one of those shows in 72, because Brinsley Schwartz and Nick Lowe were basically everywhere. The attitude and some of the kind of, clothing choices of the New York Dolls was really influential, as was the attitude of, Iggy Pop and Lou Reed. So that kind of stuff, helped pick up steam. But the Sex Pistols' arrival was just seismic, and the other end of that explosion was how quickly the Sex Pistols, especially after the Bill Grundy thing, which was right at the end of 76, it basically rendered them unable to perform live anymore,
Yeah.
So it's like they went from this explosion that arrived on the scene to basically being paralyzed in a live setting very, very quickly. And that was an interesting thing that Chris Thomas pointed out to me. Chris Thomas, one of the first things he worked on as a producer or as an engineer was the White Album with the Beatles. So at the point where they're recording Nevermind the Bollocks, the Sex Pistols are essentially unable to play live anymore. And he said it wasn't unlike the Beatles. He was like, the only setting that they could be creative in was in the studio. And they knew that. So they just embraced it. And he said it was really a trio in the studio, because Sid wasn't part of it. But he said they were very kind of well behaved and focused and not, acting like the Sex Pistols, in the studio. They were very focused on putting out the very best recording they could.
Yeah, so we mentioned there that the Sex Pistols' impact is massive. The 101ers do release one single on Chiswick Records, but they're not around very long either. Strummer takes quite a lot from this, which he ultimately brings into his next band, which of course is the Clash. But one of the more tangible legacies of this, I guess, is Stiff Records. So how does Stiff Records link into all of this stuff?
Yeah, so Nick Lowe, again, is a thread that goes through a significant, the entire book, not a significant portion of it. He's pretty much there for all of this stuff. So one of the managers that is a manager of multiple pub rock bands, Dave Robinson, and Nick Lowe, and then some of the guys from Dr. Feelgood kind of get together and help facilitate this record label with Andrew Jakeman, of course, who was one of the managers of a couple of the pub rock bands too. And Stiff Records kind of materializes in, August of 76. And the first single is a Nick Lowe single recorded at this tiny little studio called Pathway in I think that's in Islington too. Not too far from the Hope and Anchor. A tiny little studio basically becomes the house studio, and Nick Lowe becomes the house producer for this record label, Stiff, which again reflected this very kind of irreverent attitude. An early album by them was Elvis Costello, My Aim Is True, which was released, I think, a couple of weeks before Elvis died. And one of their little catchphrases was, if your king is dead, try ours. Or if your Elvis is dead, try ours. That kind of stuff. So Stiff became like the label.
Just going to mention here, Nick Lowe's production work at this point is prolific to say the least. You've got the Damned's debut single and album, Ian Dury and Graham Parker's debut albums. We mentioned that Elvis Costello's debut single and debut album, My Aim Is True. So yeah, Elvis Costello's got a little bit of a link into this scene as well.
Yeah, Elvis Costello had a band called Flip City that by some accounts were basically a Brinsley Schwartz cover band. So he was big into Brinsley Schwartz. He was big into the pub rock scene. Nick Lowe produced Elvis Costello's first 5 albums. Yeah, so and Nick Lowe, like you said, produced the Damned's first single, which is widely credited as being the first punk single. That was recorded at Pathway Studios. Nick Lowe went on to record the Damned's first album at Pathway. So Nick Lowe is everywhere. He's co-writing songs on Dr. Feelgood albums. He produced one of the Dr. Feelgood albums. He's everywhere in this thing. And of course he records, and his solo efforts are the first pub rock or the first stiff single. So he's everywhere. Was it punk's arrival that ultimately brings the whole thing down? Yes, I think without a doubt. I think it was punk. Again, it was an explosion, and the pub rock scene was kind of the fuse, I guess. Early on, it's Americana, kind of laid back, but it is roots rock. It is back to basics. It's emulating bands that have kind of paved the way, like Creedence Clearwater Revival or the band, especially the band. But then it starts to harden. It starts to reflect societal stuff going on in the UK at the time. Ian Dury comes along. These influences from the States, the New York Dolls, Lou Reed, Iggy Pop come over. The Ramones come on the scene in the mid-'70s. Things start to speed up and songs are shortening. And all of this is kind of laying the groundwork. Once you get into like 75, 76, we've got, Ian Dury, we've got Dr. Feelgood, we've got Eddie and the Hot Rods, the Count Bishops, the Stranglers are showing up on the scene. And I do include some stuff about the Stranglers because they kind of were a pub rock band if you think about whatever the definition is, but I don't really consider them to be a pub rock band. But they were in on the pub rock scene, and they're another hard, dark, very anti kind of band. And all of this is just setting the scene for punk. And once punk kind of exploded, I remember a quote from Pete Townsend, and I have not been able to find it, or I may have found a home for it in the book. Pete was kind of like, he said, if you turn on a tap for the first time in a long time, all of this dirty stuff comes out and rusty, horrible brown water comes out. And he's like, that was punk. All this sputtering, dirty stuff is coming out. And then it's all clean behind there. And he's like, that was, punk kind of was the cleanser. And after it, a whole bunch of other, it facilitated everything else to come out. But, yeah, I think punk kind of laid waste to, everything, and the pub rock scene was kind of no more after that. Well, that's the story of the punk rock scene of the 70s. Thank you to Mark for talking us through that. At the end of each episode, we each recommend something we like. Do you have anything you could recommend, Mark? Because I've been living in the States for a long time, and I did not grow up in London. Anyway, I grew up mostly in the Midlands. This is a pub rock story. I wanted not only to study the music publications at the time and talk to some of the people that were there and listen, of course, to the music. But I wanted to go and see some of these areas, some of these venues. I wanted to see the pubs. I wanted to go down in the basement of the Hope and Anchor and look around. And I wanted to see where the Tally-Ho was. And I wanted to go to the Windsor Castle. And I wanted to go to a bunch of, what used to be the Nashville. There's a guy named Aidan McManus who has a company, I guess you'd call it, called Flipside London Tours. He does tours, punk rock tours. He does Joe Strummer tours. I got in touch with him and said, hey, could we do a one-on-one pub rock tour? And he took me, and I usually over-prepare for this kind of stuff. He took me around London. He showed me Pathway Studios. He showed me Stiff Records' original, headquarters. he actually texted me later on that night and said, "Hey, we walked 12 miles today." We spent all day walking around looking at, and getting on the train and going to a couple different areas of London. And Aidan is just he's a character, and he's just an encyclopedia. He knows all kinds of stuff about the music that I love and about London. So he was always pointing out stuff like, "Oh, by the way, over there is where Madness recorded the House of Fun video," that kind of stuff, which I just love.
Fantastic. That's
Yeah.
brilliant.
So Aidan, that's what I would recommend is if you're in London and you want to go learn about, musical, venues and trivia and all that kind of stuff about the music you love, get in touch with Aidan.
That's a fantastic recommendation. If you're in London, you want to go on a music tour, look it up. I'm going to quickly recommend, obviously we are recording this the day after England were knocked out the World Cup. So I can't recommend England, but I'm going to recommend the Arsenal midfielder Mikel Merino, who has scored the winning goal twice coming off the bench in the last 16 and the quarters. He's pretty much my favourite player of the World Cup. So you bring him on for 5 minutes and he scores you the goal and puts you in the next round. So what more do you want? He fills in up front for Arsenal when we need someone, and he always delivers. So he's my recommendation from the 2026 World Cup. So we've got lots of live events coming up. Keep an eye on all our social media as usual. If you like the podcast, please leave a rating or a review. We are now on YouTube as well. So if you use YouTube, please follow, subscribe, and watch our content on there. And we will see you all next time.